Hello students, this is Professor McDermott. Well, we've come to a topic that I'm sure at least some of you have been waiting for eagerly, World War II. You know, we could easily have an entire course on this one subject and not even come to the end of it, but unfortunately we have only one lecture in which to address this fascinating topic. So I will do my best to hit the highlights. Now, we talked about how Adolf Hitler was able to capitalize on the frustration and discontentment of the German people after the German defeat in World War I, and because of the Treaty of Versailles. And Hitler, after he became Chancellor, set about fulfilling some of his promises to the German people to restore the greatness of the German Reich. The first step was to rearm Germany. Now, this was in complete violation of the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, but Hitler began to build up Germany's army, navy, and air force again. The armaments factories, which were grinding out the new war materiel to supply the enlarged armed forces, put many people back to work in Germany during the Depression. And so Hitler really accomplished two of his goals for the price of one. Another step that the Nazis took in March of 1936 was to send troops into the region of Western Germany known as the Rhineland. Now, this was also in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. This area was supposed to be a demilitarized zone. The Germans were not supposed to put any troops there to threaten France. However, the Nazis did send in troops, and the French did nothing. Then Germany got a chance to flex its muscles somewhat on the European stage when a civil war broke out in the country of Spain. This war featured on one side left-leaning socialistic Republicans versus right-wing fascistic nationalists led by General Francisco Franco. This was a bloody and brutal conflict, which was made bloodier by Hitler's supplying of Franco with military advisors, planes, and weapons throughout the war. And so Hitler had begun to play a role on the world stage, but Germany didn't really start to grab more territory for themselves until March 1938. Now, you may recall that at the Versailles Conference at the end of World War I, one of President Wilson's goals was national self-determination. In other words, he wanted to break up the large empires like the Austro-Hungarian Empire and to create smaller countries in which each ethnic group, each nation, would have its own country. And so, to some extent, that was accomplished at the end of World War I. You see on the map here that the Austro-Hungarian Empire was broken up into smaller countries: Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, and a new nation of Yugoslavia was created. Now, Austria, however, was German-speaking, and that gave Hitler an excuse to annex it to the German Reich. And so, with the connivance of some Nazi-sympathetic officials in Austria in March 1938, Hitler's tanks rolled into that country and carried out the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria. And then Hitler set his sights on Czechoslovakia because there was a region, the area in pink around the border of Czechoslovakia was inhabited by German-speaking people. This region was called the Sudetenland, and Hitler argued that since these people were culturally German, they deserved also to be part of the German Reich. And so a conference took place at Munich in Germany in September of 1938, featuring the prime ministers of France and of Great Britain and Hitler to discuss this issue. And what do you know? This conference decided that the Germans should be allowed to annex the Sudetenland, and in return, Hitler swore that he would not ask for any more territory in Europe. This was the last territorial grab. And so the Prime Minister of Great Britain went home to great acclaim, and he got off the plane and he said, "We have achieved peace in our time." This approach to the Nazis we call appeasement, giving the Nazis what they want in hopes that they would resist asking for anything more. It's somewhat like the approach you might take to a 3-year-old, giving him or her a cookie to avoid a temper tantrum. Now, why would the great powers of Great Britain and France take this approach, which seems so ridiculous in hindsight? Well, hindsight is 2020, and they could not foresee the depths of depravity that the Nazi Empire would take on. But also, you have to realize what these countries had been through in World War I. And the millions of men that had been lost in that conflict. And so they were very reluctant to go to war again with Germany if they could avoid it. However, with Hitler's next move, the blinders finally began to come off, and the British and French realized what they were up against, because in March 1939, in spite of his solemn promise at Munich, Hitler suddenly annexed Bohemia and Moravia. This was the western part of Czechoslovakia, what we now call the Czech Republic. And so at this point, the British decided that they had to draw a line in the sand, and so they made an agreement with Poland that if Hitler attacked Poland, the British would go to war against Germany. Stalin in Russia was looking at all of this, and he was no dummy. He realized that if the Germans took Poland, that next they would threaten the USSR. And not wanting that to happen, Stalin went to Hitler and cut a secret deal called the Non-Aggression Pact. This was in August 1939. And according to this deal, Germany and the Soviets were to invade Poland at the same time. And they would split up Poland amongst themselves. Sound familiar? The Polish people have been through so much in their history. They are real survivors. But yet another partition of Poland by Germany and the Soviets this time. And also, the Soviets were promised Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the 3 Baltic republics, to become part of their empire. And all this took place when the plan was executed on September 1st, 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland from the west, and simultaneously the Soviets invaded from the east. And really you could see the shape of things to come in this invasion. The first of the many terrible atrocities that would be committed during this war was carried out by the Soviets when they rounded up 15,000 officers of the Polish army, took them out into the Khatin Forest, and simply executed them. Now, of course, that is not how you're supposed to treat prisoners of war, but Stalin was already thinking about the period after the war and how to keep Poland under control, and he knew that to eliminate the leadership was the best way to do that. This war in Poland was over within a few weeks. The Nazis simply rolled in to destroy the woefully unprepared Polish military force. But Britain and France at this point did declare war on Germany because of the invasion of Poland, and World War II had begun. Now, Hitler had been in World War I, of course, and he remembered it very well, and he was determined to avoid the two-front war that the Germans had gotten bogged down in because of the failure of the Schlieffen Plan in World War I. And so Hitler's strategy at the start of the war was a pretty good one, to take out all of his opponents, but to take them out one at a time, so he would only have to fight on one front at a time. Now, because of advances in airplanes and tanks, which the Germans called panzers, this actually had become possible. Improved aircraft and tanks really shifted the advantage in war back to the offensive side. It was now possible again, unlike World War I, to mount a very effective attack using aerial bombing and tanks. And so Poland was the first to feel the force of Hitler's blitzkrieg. This means lightning war, in which the tanks simply had their way essentially bulldozed through that country. And then, of course, Hitler set his sights on France. Now, after World War I, the French had constructed a line of forts along their eastern boundary called the Maginot Line to defend against any further German invasion. However, they hadn't bothered to fortify the Belgian border yet again because the Belgians had become French allies after the war, and the French expected the Belgians to defend their own borders. But in 1935, Belgium withdrew from their treaty with France, and that left the Belgian border undefended. So when Hitler invaded France, just as in World War I, he went through Belgium, and this started on May 10th, 1940, the invasion of Belgium. And then, less than 6 weeks later, France was already knocked out of the war. Hitler had taken Paris and occupied the northern and western parts of France. The southeastern corner of France, the Nazis put under a puppet regime. You see on the map, it says Vichy France. This was a Nazi collaborationist regime in the south and east of France. But France was taken out of the war, leaving only Great Britain as a major power, standing up to Nazi Germany at this point. Now, the Nazis planned to invade the island of Great Britain, but the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, convinced Hitler that no invasion should take place on the ground until they had established air supremacy over the island of Britain. And so the Battle of Britain that took place from July to October in 1840 was entirely fought in the air by aircraft and through bombing raids. And this, of course, became legendary as a great moment in British history, especially when the Germans began to bomb neighborhoods in England. This happened actually, this was not the original intention. Hitler started out bombing only military installations and airstrips, but accidentally the Nazis bombed a neighborhood in London, and quickly the British retaliated by bombing a neighborhood in Berlin. And so at that point, all the gloves were off, and from that point forward, both sides began indiscriminate bombing, essentially, of civilian targets. It was a great tragedy that really happened by accident. But the bombing of civilian targets in Britain we call the Blitz. And this happened night after night during that summer and early fall of 1940. You see a picture on the top right there of a typical night during the Blitz. Heroes of the Blitz, well, the royal family really proved their nobility during this period. The king of the time, George VI, and his wife, Queen Elizabeth, who were the parents of the current Queen Elizabeth II, could have vacated London and gone to stay in any of the British colonies and could have been safe, but they adamantly refused to go. And so they became a symbol of resistance as they toured around through neighborhoods showing their fearlessness during the Blitz. You may have seen a movie that came out a few years ago called The King's Speech about King George's attempt to overcome his stammering problem, his speech impediment, and how he did learn to speak on the radio and became very inspiring figure through these radio speeches. Another great speaker, of course, for the British during World War II was a man who became Prime Minister in late spring of 1940, Sir Winston Churchill. Churchill had been the only man in the British Parliament during the pre-war period who warned what Hitler was up to and who argued against appeasement. So it was fitting that he became Prime Minister. And I have a first clip of one of his great speeches I'd like for you to listen to. Now, in order to do this, you need to go to the folder called Supplementary Videos and click on the file that says Churchill Never Surrender. This will take you into YouTube and you'll hear an excerpt from the speech. So please do that, and we'll resume in a moment. Welcome back. Well, that's a very powerful and legendary speech for obvious reasons, but it's interesting, the sentences at the very end of the speech. He says that even if things get desperate in the Isle of Britain, he expects the New World to come to the aid of the English. And by the New World, of course, he means us, the United States. Now, it was natural for Churchill to think this way in terms of Anglo-American cooperation because his mother, Jenny Jerome, was actually an American. She had married Lord Randolph Churchill, so in a sense, Churchill felt a real kinship with Americans. He had a close friendship with President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and so he really hoped strongly for America's arrival into World War II. Another speech, very famous speech from this period, actually from the period just before the Battle of Britain beginning, is called the Finest Hour speech. So if you go back to that folder, click on the link for the Finest Hour speech, and then rejoin me in just a moment, please. All right, well, this is an interesting document. If we were in class right now, I would ask you what you thought Churchill meant by perverted science. You think about that for a second. Probably talking about the perverted science that led to huge weapons of mass destruction, but also perhaps the science of eugenics, which Hitler deployed to eliminate quote-unquote undesirable people within the Third Reich. And Group 2, you're going to have a document that relates to this program of eliminating people who were considered inferior by the Nazis. Really the Battle of Britain was a very fine hour for the English people. The Royal Air Force was vastly outnumbered by the Luftwaffe, but they did have a few advantages. Their aircraft were more modern and superior to the German aircraft. The British also had much better radar system to detect incoming bombers. But most importantly was military intelligence, because at a place called Bletchley Park, under the leadership of a man named Alan Turing, there was a team of codebreakers, many of whom were women, who wanted to contribute to the war effort. This was their way to do that. Who were working on breaking the German code, which was called the Enigma. It was encoded with a very complicated machine, and the settings on this machine were changed every single day So this was a monumental task, and really, most the Germans believed that it was impossible to break Enigma. But the Bletchley Park code breakers did manage to break the Enigma code, and so this saved countless lives because the British often were aware of where and when the Germans were planning to bomb their cities. Nevertheless, during the Blitz, more than 20,000 British civilians were killed, and that led to a great deal of sympathy in the United States for the British. Now, the American public was still very isolationist. As we saw, having refused to join the League of Nations, wanting things to get back to normal after World War I, the U.S. had retreated into its isolation bubble. And President Roosevelt knew he had to bring the American people along very gradually to support the British. And so he began that process on December 29th, 1940, in one of his fireside chats that he regularly gave on the radio. This one was called The Arsenal of Democracy. And in this speech, FDR argued that the United States should become the arsenal, that is, the weapons storehouse, for democratic nations that were resisting Hitler. In other words, we should start supplying weapons to especially the British in their fight against Hitler. And this was favorably received by the general public, so that by March 1941, FDR was able to get through Congress the law authorizing what was called Lend-Lease. Now, this was a program by which we lent the British aircraft, tanks, ships, guns, etc. And in return, we received leases for bases in some of the British colonies, military bases. So that's why it's called Lend-Lease. But it was a way for us to give some support to the British, even though the American public was not ready for the United States to come into the war. In fact, we see that unreadiness when we contemplate what was going on in Asia at this point in time, where the Japanese had very successfully modernized their military and their nation in general, and were prepared to emerge as a global superpower. And so they began this process in 1931 by invading the northeastern region of China called Manchuria, and then proceeding to try to take over the rest of China. As they were doing this, the Japanese signed a treaty with Hitler and Mussolini that was called the Anti-Comintern Pact, because this treaty was supposedly aimed at the Communist International, led by the Soviets. And so this treaty created what we call the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan in World War II. And of course, we call the French, the British, the United States, and later the Soviets, the Allies. In 1937, the Japanese army reached the Chinese city of Nanking and decided to make an example out of Nanking to try to terrify the rest of the Chinese citizens into surrendering. And so they proceeded to loot, plunder, burn, rape, destroy, and murder in Nanking for several months, killing hundreds of thousands of the citizens of Nanking in the most horrible, abominable way. And this rape of Nanking is really one of the most horrible war crimes ever committed by any nation in the history of the world. Now, we and the rest of the world knew what was going on in Nanking. People managed to escape. They told their stories, and this was well publicized throughout the world. And yet, the United States really did nothing to try to stop this or to resist Japanese aggression in Asia. In fact, we were still selling oil to the Japanese while this was going on. It wasn't until 1941 that FDR finally cut off sales of petroleum to the Japanese Empire. Now, when the United States did cut off Japanese oil, this left the Japanese with a real dilemma. Their islands had very few natural resources, and they especially needed oil if they were going to carry on their war machine and maintain their empire. And so by July 1941, the next step of Japanese expansion was their takeover of Indochina, that is what's now Vietnam, Thailand, and Laos, and Cambodia. And they intended to use this as a staging ground for an attack on the Dutch East Indies. This is now a collection of islands. You can see them there off the coast of Southeast Asia, now known as Indonesia. But at that time, these were a Dutch colony, and they were very rich in oil. And so the Japanese intended to take them over for that purpose. But they knew that the United States would never stand for that, because you may recall that after the Spanish-American War, we had inherited the Philippines right next door to the Dutch East Indies. And the Japanese understood that we could never allow Japan to take over the East Indies right on the doorstep of the Philippines. And so that's why Japan invaded Pearl Harbor, or bombed the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. This was intended as a preemptive strike against the U.S. Pacific Fleet, so that when the Japanese did invade the East Indies, our fleet would not be in a position to stop them. That was the rationale for Pearl Harbor. Now, FDR and the U.S. commanders knew that the Japanese were going to attack somewhere, because we had broken the Japanese codes, actually. But they didn't know where, and nobody really thought that it was possible, given the limitations of flying range and so forth, that the Japanese could attack Hawaii. And so they expected that attack somewhere else, like maybe Guam or the Philippines. And that's why the Pearl Harbor attack came as such a total surprise, and it was such a devastating blow to our Navy, what FDR called a date which will live in infamy. Fortunately, about half of our fleet that was based at Pearl was out on maneuvers, and so the destruction was not as great as it might have been. So, obviously we were at war with Japan at this point, but the terms of the Anti-Comintern Pact did not require the Germans to go to war in support of Japan. After all, Japan had attacked us. So Hitler really didn't have to go to war against us, but on December 11th, he decided to give the British people a great gift by declaring war on the United States of America, even though he didn't have to. And so that brought us into the war in Europe as well. Now, this reflects the fact that by this point in the war, Hitler had essentially lost his grip on reality and believed that the Nazi state was completely invincible, unstoppable. He had shown this earlier in 1941 in June, when he turned against his former ally Stalin and invaded the Soviet Union. Now, invading Russia historically has always proven to be a terrible, terrible mistake. You remember Napoleon and his debacle in 1812. And ultimately this would prove to be the case for Hitler. And the weaknesses of Hitler's strategy and his attempt to make himself into a military strategist were revealed in this campaign in Russia. For example, the Nazis might have succeeded had they just driven straight on and captured Moscow, but instead Hitler diverted troops here and there, for instance, to Leningrad, which was the communist name for the old city of St. Petersburg, built by Tsar Peter. And so that slowed down their advance. Meanwhile, winter was coming on, and that winter was especially severe, with temperatures going as low as -30 Fahrenheit, and the German troops were ill-equipped to deal with this, but Hitler refused to pull back. And so, as a result, this Operation Barbarossa, this campaign in Russia, racked up more casualties than any other military campaign in history, 1.3 million in the first year. The turning point did not come until late 1942, when the Nazis began to besiege the city of Stalingrad. And the Soviets put up a determined resistance and eventually began pushing the Nazis back from Stalingrad in 1943, and the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union began to collapse. But it was Hitler's invasion of Russia that really, I believe, brought about the terrible consequences suffered by the Jewish people, what was called the final solution to the Jewish problem, what we call the Holocaust. Now, granted, Hitler had already announced as early as January 1939 to the German parliament that he intended to annihilate the Jewish race in Europe. But this program really did not come about until the Nazis invaded Russia. Because when they invaded Russia, there was a very large Jewish population in Russia and the Ukraine. And so what the Nazis did, they didn't want to be responsible for feeding all of these Jews, whom they despised. And so they simply executed them all. They massacred them in the most brutal and horrible way. And Group 1, you have a document that describes this slaughter. Now, most German soldiers were not Nazis. We should be clear on that. Most German soldiers had just been drafted into the service, and they were not hardcore Nazis. And German soldiers, the ordinary German soldiers who were exposed to this, were actually extremely horrified and demoralized by the massacres that happened on the Eastern Front. And so Hitler and the Nazis realized they had to come up with another solution, a more quiet, out-of-the-way method of eliminating the Jews. And so this is where the focus shifted to the concentration camps, to the prisons in the Third Reich. And in July 1941, the prison commanders, the camp commanders, were ordered to begin the extermination of all the Jews, and more Jews began to be brought into the camp for this purpose. A conference took place at a place called Wannsee in January of 1942 to coordinate the efforts of different government military departments to bring about the extermination of Jews, and thus the final solution was born, as we know it, the system of death camps. Now, the Allies knew what was going on during the war. Some people had managed to escape from Auschwitz, and they actually told their story to the Pope, Pope Pius XII in Rome, and Pius XII told FDR about what he had learned about these death camps. But the high command of our military was unwilling to divert resources to try to liberate the camps. And granted, this would have been an extremely difficult war objective. But basically, our commanders didn't see it as a military objective. They saw the potential problems, and they feared that it would detract from the overall war effort. And so we did nothing during the war until 1945 to liberate the concentration camps. And so 6 million Jews and others as well were destroyed there. We did begin a bombing campaign over the rest of Germany, and this happened primarily because Stalin wanted the Allies to open up a second front. In other words, he wanted us to invade France so that it would take some of the pressure off the Soviet army as they fought the Nazis. So essentially, what emerged was not D-Day in 1942, that would come later, but instead Churchill and Roosevelt agreed to invade North Africa in 1942 and to push the Nazis back there, but also to really step up the bombing with the help of the U.S. Air Force, the bombing of Germany. Now, before the U.S. entered the war, the British had tried to do precision bombing of military targets in Germany by daylight, but they discovered that even though their bombers had enough fuel to reach Germany, their fighter planes could not carry enough fuel to get to Germany and back on these missions. And so the fighter planes couldn't go, and that meant that the bombers were sitting ducks, and many of them were shot down on these daytime raids. And so instead, the British had opted for the safer strategy of bombing at nighttime. But that meant they couldn't see their targets, and so they were simply dropping bombs indiscriminately on civilian areas, killing civilians. World War II was really a total war. All right, this was a war in which no one was safe because entire societies had mobilized their whole population and all their resources for the war effort. And so, in a sense, this made civilians into legitimate targets for this modern and truly horrifying type of total warfare. Now, when we came into the war, our Air Force didn't really want to get involved in carpet bombing neighborhoods. And our commanders believed that our B-17 bombers could bomb war targets in the daytime without fighter planes escorting them. But we ran into the same problems that the British had, high casualties, a lot of failures. And so eventually we adopted the British approach, and we too began to bomb civilians indiscriminately. We did not, as I said, try to bomb the concentration camps. Doing that, after all, would have killed the Jews who were in the camps, and that would certainly have been problematic. Although, of course, it might have prevented the slaughter of many more Jews. So it would have been a very difficult moral decision. But in any case, we didn't. But we did kill more than 600,000 in league with the British. We killed more than 600,000 German civilians during World War II with our bombing campaign. Again, this is total war. Back to the Pacific theater. So this war was all Japan in the early stages. The Japanese really had their way. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan immediately invaded the Philippines and defeated our forces and our Filipino allies there. It was still a colony of the U.S. So when this happened, the Japanese created prisoner of war camps and began marching our troops and the Filipino troops to prisoner of war camps on what became known as the Bataan Death March. And essentially, the POWs were treated so cruelly, starvation and really cruel treatment, that about 25,000 of these prisoners of war died before they ever reached the camp. And this was very typical of the Japanese approach to prisoners of war. They had not signed the Geneva Convention, so they were not bound by its terms of how to treat POWs. And in Japanese culture, surrender was considered to be a terrible shame or disgrace. Essentially, if you surrendered in war, you had lost your manhood, you had lost your humanity. And so the Japanese who captured these POWs really felt that they were subhuman and treated them as such. The Japanese actually, before they would surrender, they would rather commit suicide. And this happened time and time again. As we fought the Japanese, our commanders would try to get the Japanese to surrender, and instead they would simply kill themselves. And of course, the kamikaze pilots who flew their planes into U.S. ships and aircraft carriers were another example of this. As the war went badly for the Japanese, again, the soldiers would rather commit suicide than see their nation surrender, because there was so much shame attached to surrender in Japanese culture. Well, this had to do with the warrior ethic of the samurai. It was a cultural difference, but it led to a lot of hard feelings, obviously, as stories of this cruel treatment began to leak out. And so this war became very bitter on both sides in the Pacific. Now, our strategy was very simple. We had to fight our way back towards Japan by capturing all the islands held by the Japanese one by one. The goal was to get close enough to Japan so that our bombers could bomb the Japanese homeland. And once when I was giving this lecture, a student raised his hand and he said, Mr. McDermott, why didn't we just bomb them from the Soviet Union, from Siberia? And I had to scratch my head because I had never thought of that. I love it when students ask questions like that, because it helps me to learn new things. Well, I did some research, and turns out that Stalin had made a non-aggression pact with the Japanese and their emperor Hirohito. And so Stalin was not willing to let us bomb Japan from the Soviet Union because he had his hands full with Hitler, and he really didn't want to go to war with Japan. So we couldn't do that. So we had to go through the very difficult process of taking back all of those islands one by one, and often very brutal hand-to-hand combat taking place in terrible weather conditions in the midst of tropical rainforests. This was a very difficult, slow slog through trying to win back these islands. In a way, the turning point of the war, or really the first bright spot for the American side, happened in June 1942, the great naval battle of Midway. Now, this was a very unusual battle. Typically, in a sea battle, you would have two ships lined up side by side, firing at each other with cannons. But in this battle, the two naval forces were actually 175 miles apart, and the fighting consisted of planes taking off from aircraft carriers and fighting each other or trying to destroy the opponent's aircraft carriers and ships. And in this duel, the United States emerged victorious. We only lost one aircraft carrier, while the Japanese lost 4 of theirs, a very significant defeat for Japan. But this Battle of Midway really was significant in that it marked the end of traditional naval warfare. Well, as you know, I'm sure, we finally did, in cooperation with the British, invade France through the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, which we call D-Day. And the Soviets, having stopped the Nazi advance, were now advancing towards Berlin from the east. So it became simply a matter of time before the war would be ended. Franklin D. Roosevelt was reelected to an unprecedented 4th term as U.S. President in 1944. You couldn't do that now because after his death, a constitutional amendment was passed limiting the president to 2 terms. But he was elected 4 times. However, very early in his 4th term, FDR visited his second home, that is in Warm Springs, Georgia, at the little White House, and while he was there, he suffered a cerebral hemorrhage and died on April the 12th, 1945, plunging the nation into mourning and making his vice president, Harry S. Truman of Missouri, the President of the United States. Also, our troops were advancing up the Italian peninsula, having taken North Africa. We had leapfrogged over into Italy, had been fighting our way up the Italian peninsula until on June 4th, 1944, right before D-Day, Rome was taken by Allied troops. And then later, April 28th, 1945, Mussolini, trying to escape, was captured by a paramilitary group in Italy and was executed, and his corpse was desecrated by peasant women who urinated on it because of all the suffering he had caused the Italian people. So Mussolini was dead. Italy was out of the war, April 28th, 1945. Hitler knew that the end was near. And so he and his longtime mistress, Eva Braun, retreated into their underground bunker in Berlin. And Hitler and Eva Braun were married on April 29th, 1945. And then the next morning, Eva Braun took poison, and Hitler shot himself. They both committed suicide there, April 30th, 1945, and what must have been the worst honeymoon in history. But when Hitler did kill himself, the German High Command surrendered to the Allies on May 8th, 1945, what we call VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. So the war was over in Europe. The Nazis had been defeated. But the Pacific War went on. More American success as the war went on. By February 1945, we had recaptured Manila in a really bloody hand-to-hand battle in February 1945. By March 17th, we had taken the island of Iwo Jima, June 21st, Okinawa, and as of early March, we were close enough to the Japanese mainland that we could begin bombing. And so on March 9th, we unleashed a massive bombing of Tokyo. And actually what we used, we didn't use traditional bombs. We used a new chemical which had been developed called napalm. Now, napalm was a chemical that ignited whenever it came into contact with organic material, like trees, for instance. But most Japanese houses were made of wood and paper. And so when we dropped this napalm on Tokyo, the entire city went up in flames, and somewhere between 80 to 100,000 Japanese were killed in the firebombing of Tokyo in that one night. But Japan showed no signs of surrender. Again, that was the most shameful thing that you could do in Japanese warrior culture. And so Truman was faced with a terrible decision. Either we invade the Japanese mainland at the cost of possibly millions of our own soldiers, or we use our new secret weapon, which had been developed primarily by Jewish refugee scientists. The idea had actually been suggested by Albert Einstein, the atomic bomb, unleashing the power of nuclear fission to create the most massive explosions known to man up to that point. And this Manhattan Project was successful. We did beat the Germans in developing the atomic bomb, and it was ready to go. And so Truman ultimately decided, as you know, that to spare American lives, we had to drop the atomic bomb first on the city of Hiroshima on August 6th, 1945. You see the aftermath there. And then 3 days later on the city of Nagasaki, Japan. And again, hundreds of thousands of people were killed, and many more over time from radiation poisoning. And this had two effects. First of all, it made World War II the first and only nuclear war that has ever been fought in human history up to this point. Second, it finally convinced the Emperor Hirohito that Japan had to surrender. And so, over the objection of his generals, it was Hirohito who went on the radio, announced that Japan was surrendering, and ultimately led to VJ Day, the end of the Pacific War. But that left the world with a new situation to confront. We had entered the atomic age, and that threat of nuclear warfare would hang over the lives of every man, woman, and child on the Earth in the post-war period, as we'll see in the next lecture.